Today I'll show you how to edit this clip using the 3D camera in After Effects.
Imagine you suddenly lose your father and then your mother abandons you. Imagine you then spend your childhood in...
The first step is to create a new composition and import the stock footage of storm clouds moving in the sky. This clip can be found on YouTube. Then I'll also import a white flash overlay footage that will represent lightning flashing in the sky. I then disable the audio and turn the audio right down since it can distract and also cause After Effects to lag. Before I move the clouds onto the timeline, I double click it to open the project source file, and using the trim bracket icons I can select the few seconds of clip that I want. Then when I drag it onto the layer it will start at the point that I marked. I then put the flash overlay on top, set the blend mode to overlay and the opacity to 30%. When I play this back I get this neat looking lightning effect to go with the stormy clouds. Since I'm finished here, I will pre-compose these into one tidy layer. I can always open this if I need to make changes later, but I shouldn't need to. Next I add a CC lens effect and set it to 163 size and 52 convergence. This is optional, you can play around with this if you want, and it might not matter depending on the camera movement. I'm basically using this to give a slight stretch around the center and give the effect of looking up at the sky. Next thing to do is import all the scene images into the timeline. Ideally you will want to have a few objects cut or masked out from their background as separate PNG layers. For this one I've used a mix of images found on Google and masked out, and for the lady and boy I've had to screenshot it from MagnatesMedia clip since it's nearly impossible or would take a lot of time to find these, but they're most likely on some stock website somewhere. Ideally for your projects you want to have a good mix of objects as well as background, middle ground and foreground layers. The more layers and images you have the better scenes and camera animations you can create. But it can also make the camera movement trickier to keyframe. Make sure you practice using very basic scenes like this one first. Then I enable 3D for all these layers, and now what I'm going to do is rearrange all these layers in 3D space. My advice is to pick a point on your timeline or pick a scene which will have all or at least most of the layers in view, and then you can create camera movements from that point. For example, the MagnatesMedia clip starts with only the sky in view, and towards the end nearly everything is in view as the camera has zoomed out to reveal it. I want to start by setting up the scene towards the end of the clip where almost everything is in view, and then I'll work backwards and forward from there. Next thing I do is change the view to 2 views and make sure one of the views is set to top, so now I can move my layers back in Z space and create a strong depth of field. And I can see all the layers from above and move them accordingly. Then I add a camera with the default settings, and now I can see this camera from the top view. What I do now is push the background layers away from the camera, so things like the sky, moon and trees. You want to push these back in a realistic way. For example, things like the sky and moon are really far away in real life, so you want to make these very far away in Z space and away from the camera. What you'll notice when I push it back, the layer starts to shrink in size. The best fix for this is to simply scale the size back up to fit the preview window using the scale property. You want to keep repeating this process until you're happy with the scene setting. So push a layer back, scale it up, maybe push it back some more, then scale it up again. You can keep doing this or just push it back and rescale it once if it works and looks right the first time. A tip I can give you is to make sure each layer is on its own Z position. In other words, don't have 2 layers at the same distance from the camera, unless they absolutely must be side by side. So here I have the left tree at the front, then the lady behind it, then the second tree a little back, and then the boy, then the gravestone. Each layer has its own depth and distance from the camera. This will look very realistic as the camera moves through the center. For the single tombstone layer, I slightly skew it along the Y rotation to give it a slight angle. Then to make the trees curve around, I add the warp effect to the background trees layer and set the style to arc and the bend value to -50. This makes the tree line curve around in a way that makes it seem like you are standing beneath them and looking up at the sky. Other than that, the scene is pretty basic. All the back layers are really far away and all the front layers are close together at the front towards the camera. Next step is to create a null object for each camera movement you want to create. For this example, I'm going to have the camera make 3 distinct movements, so I'll create 3 null objects. Then I'm going to parent link the camera to the null object above it, and and then parent link that null object to the null object above, and so forth. So basically each null object and camera is parent linked to the one that is directly above it. Now why do I do this? While controlling the camera and keyframing all of its movement on one layer is very wonky and rigid. It's very difficult to make two or more camera movements happen at the same time and look smooth. By using the null objects we can have overlapping keyframes and movements, giving the camera a more natural and realistic movement. For this tutorial I'll rename the null objects camera movement 1, 2 and 3. The first camera movement will go from right to left, and I animate this with two simple keyframes. What I noticed while doing this is that the tree doesn't cover most of the view like it should, so all I do is scale it up and position it so it does. I then add blur and brightness contrast effects to make it similar to the original clip. I highlight these keyframes and hit F9 to smooth them out. You can play around with the curves in the graphs editor, but for now I'll just focus on the camera movements and null objects. For the next camera movement I select the null layer for the camera movement 2 and keyframe it before the previous movement stops. This is the overlapping keyframes I was talking about earlier, so this movement will begin before the previous one has finished. Then I move earlier in the timeline and move the camera's position in Z space to make it zoom into the moon. I also slightly move the Y and X positions to make sure the boy's head is on the right hand side edge. You can see in the top view how the camera has moved forward through the layers. Then the third movement or third null layer I will keyframe the next movement to go up towards the sky and off to the right hand side until it's looking up at the sky. This is a simple way to do this movement and will work for now. As you get better at camera movement you can start to create null objects anchored around both camera nodes and move the camera around that way, but I recommend practicing basic movements and get familiar with using these null objects first. The next thing I'm going to do is add Z rotation keyframes to the camera itself. So as the camera moves to look up at the sky, it will also rotate towards the right. Bear in mind I'm working back to front, so the final scene the camera actually starts looking at the sky and rotates down to the left and zooms out until the boy, lady and trees are in view, then moves to the left. And here's the final edit.
Imagine you suddenly lose your father and then your mother abandons you. Imagine you then spend your childhood in...
Let me know if this was easier to follow this time and if you want more tutorials on the 3D camera. Thanks for watching, see you next time.